So we start again through this moment where Stanley directly confronts Blanche's immersion in illusions. Says there isn't a goddamn thing but imagination. Here is, I think, this is where we see that diametric opposition between these two characters. His understanding of Blanche's identity is simply imagination and lies and conceit and tricks. And that's all that he thinks there is to her. He says, look at yourself. Take a look in that worn out Mardi Gras outfit. And this attack on her greatest point of vulnerability is, I think, the moment where we have such a direct confrontation between their values and their ideologies. It's interesting that he, identifies this kind of theatrical outfit and also the kind of bawdiness of her nature and identity in the Mardi Gras element. And attacks actually the kind of the pretense of social class, rented for 50 cents from some rag picker. So he again attacks her in all of these aspects of the performative rendition of her identity. And then he said, I've been on to you from the start. Not once did you pull any wool over this boy's eyes. There's this sense of, I think, strange language here that infantilizes him. He takes real pride and sees it as a kind of an opportunity to be competitive, actually, to prevent him from seeing any of this reality. Sorry, to prevent him from understanding this reality. It's an act of kind of aggressive competition. She says, sprinkle the place with powder and spray perfume and cover the light bulb with a paper lantern, and lo and behold, the place is turned into Egypt and you are the queen of the Nile. And this is this direct actually sort of elucidation and articulation of the purpose behind Blanche's adornment of the physical environment and the paper lantern symbol itself. This is directly articulating what is left unsaid when she goes about carrying out these actions. And finally he says, do you hear me? And he walks into the bedroom. So again, this sort of spatial domination is such a feature of Williams' stagecraft, I think, is another sign of what is about to take place. And then the mise-en-scène here and the stage setting is really important because these lurid reflections appear on the walls around Blanche. And so there is this, first of all, this sense of spatial vulnerability in the stage setting. And it deliberately reflects the subjective content of her mind as such a integral part of the plastic theatre. And the shadows are of a grotesque and menacing form. Again, there's this sort of nightmarish savagery that we see as the downward trajectory of Blanche's character from a position of false elevation to a position of menacing savagery. She then again attempts to channel this evasive impulse into this phone call with Shep Huntley of Dallas. He's so well known, he doesn't require any address. Just ask anybody. Wait, no, I couldn't find it right now. Please understand. No. And there's this great panic about the failure of this phone call that she attempts to formulate here. So the falsity is a kind of call for help. She's trapped from the outside world. There's the sense actually of the outside world kind of collapsing in on Blanche, and she actually at this moment in time attempts to make a phone call outside of the boundaries of the set, of the apartment, and that it's completely unresponsive. There is no outside world that cares for her concerns. Then she sets the phone down and crosses warily into the kitchen. The night is filled with inhuman voices like cries in a jungle. So we've got, again, this quite... I find the language, actually, of Williams' stage direction is quite unsettling, in terms of what he represents as savagery in the way that he goes about doing so. Because he gets this jungle cries as a descent into savagery that I think we're about to see in terms of Stanley's behaviour. The shadows and lurid reflections move sinuously as flames along the wall spaces. So this sense of fluidity and the vulnerability between the internal and external environment is extremely important here, because it gives us a sense, I think, of boundaries being transgressed and transcended, and that obviously has a sort of very direct physical equivalent with the act of rape itself, that act of physical violation of the boundaries themselves of a body being transgressed, I think are communicated through the setting here. There's an equivalence, I think, between the fluidity of the boundaries of the set and the boundary between inside and outside, and also the boundaries of Blanche's body. Through the back wall of the rooms, which have become transparent, can be seen the sidewalk. So we have this huge sort of paradox, this sort of physical paradox of Williams' stagecraft. The Blanche is trapped inside, but vulnerable to kind of wider social forces, and there is in fact now no real distinction between herself and the external forces that are at play in society at this moment in time. A prostitute has rolled a drunkard here, and this story itself, I think, ends up becoming a kind of an example of foreshadowing to a certain extent. Prostitute has rolled a drunkard, so there's this sense of weakness and violence and universal savagery involved in the tale that is told here. He pursues her along the walk, overtakes her, and there is a struggle. A policeman's whistle breaks it up and the figures disappear. So in this instance, there's an actual sort of institutional intervention. The laws of society protect the vulnerable character in this particular moment in time. And there's a sort of inverse here of a kind of vulnerable feminine figure doing the act of transgression and the act of criminality, where obviously that's the inverse situation to what we're about to see. Blanche is the one that's on the receiving end of the act of violence and criminality. Some moments later, the Negro woman appears around the corner with a sequin bag which the prostitute had dropped on the walk. She is rooting excitedly through it. So there's this act of predation that mirrors standing. And I think, again, that sense in which the moral fabric of society is breaking down, and that those forces of violence and materialism and moral corruption that are being unleashed in wider society are now coming home to bear on Blanche herself. She presses her knuckles to her lips and returns slowly to the phone, and she speaks in a hoarse whisper. This hoarse whisper is an interesting use of sound to a certain extent, because she shows the signs of fragmentation of her identity through the way that she communicates. This is Western Union. Yes, I want to take down this message. Desperate circumstances, caught in a trap, caught in... So her way for help is again interrupted. She's interrupted when she makes this call to the outside. And the bathroom door is then thrown open again in that regressive display of confidence. Stanley comes out in brilliant silk pajamas and grins at her with that sense of sinister threat. So again, the colours show us the vibrant power that he possesses, and therefore the hostility that he channels this towards Blanche with in this moment in time. She gasps and backs away from the phone. He stares at her for a count of 10, and then a clicking becomes audible from the telephone, steady and rasping. He left the phone on the hook. And so he realises here that she's called for help and that she's trapped, but seems so utterly undisturbed by this that he feels confident enough to say to her, that at this moment in time, he flags up her error. So it's a kind of display of confidence, I think, to pinpoint that particular mistake. He crosses to it deliberately and sets it back on the hook. So he shuts off that mode of communication between Blanche and the outside world. After he's replaced it, he stares at her again, and his mouth slowly curving into a grin as he waits between Blanche and the outer door. So again, his confidence is being displayed through this stage direction, but also his occupation of physical space is between Blanche and the outer door. He controls the physical environment and prevents her from moving from the internal feature of the set to the outside feature of the set, which is so frequently a display of power and command in this. The barely audible blue piano begins to drum up louder, so that sense of reality again impinging on Blanche's consciousness is communicated through the music, and the sound of it turns into the roar of an approaching locomotive. So there's this increasing intensity and increasing force of the penetration of the forces of reality, which matches the equivalent. If we see the forces of reality penetrating Blanche's life, it has this disturbing sexual connotation that finds its physical equivalent in Stanley's act of rape, of him quite literally penetrating Blanche's body, and that therefore that moment of physical violation becomes one also of the domineering wielding of power, of the ideology and the materialistic values that he represents. So Blanche finally straightens and says, let me get by you. Get by me? Sure, go ahead. He moves back a pace in the doorway. So here there's this notion of physical command that's all important. I think it is extremely fruitful comparison with the way that McCann and Goldberg command the physical space in the birthday party, particularly in the run up to and during the interrogation scene, around the act of sitting. She then says, you stand over there, and she indicates a further position, grinning. You get plenty of room to walk by me now, not with you there, but I've got to get out somehow. You think I'll interfere with you? Ha. So there's this kind of standoff here between the two of them, where he actually kind of seems to be allowing her the freedom to escape at this moment in time, to move off, to go away in some fashion. And she opts not to at this point. And then the blue piano goes softly. She turns confusedly and makes a faint gesture. I think there's this kind of suggestion of the loss of hope in that stage direction, that she actually gives up because I think she senses that power and fate are on the wrong side of her, that she is on the wrong side of them, sorry. And then the inhuman jungle voices rise up, the ascent of savagery, the ascent of the moral barbarism of Stanley's values, again, being communicated through the use of sound here. He takes a step towards her, biting his tongue, which protrudes between his lips. And there's a really interesting suggestion, I think, here, of him appearing to be almost like a snake, his tongue through the lips, I think, shows us him in again through the lens of this animal imagery that he's so frequently represented by Williams in the stage directions, but also I think by the other characters in the play. There is a great sense of him being barbarous and animalistic. Stanley softly says, come to think of it, maybe you wouldn't be bad to interfere with. And so here, this repetition of the phrase, which he uses a number of times earlier on in the play, I think shows us the element of premeditation in the rape itself, but also the fatalistic element again. That the fact that even the vocabulary crops up in reference to the same ideas, I think is an interesting way of anchoring that violation in terms of the concept of fatalism. Stanley then says, come to think of it, maybe you wouldn't be bad to interfere with, and then Blanche moves backwards through the door into the bedroom. And again, her movements here are in response to his sort of domineering behaviour, so there's not a sense of blaming Blanche here, but it is interesting that the way that Williams represents this is that Blanche's almost instinctive manoeuvre in response to Stanley's kind of menacing sexuality is to move into the bedroom. And that there's almost a sense here of her language again being at odds with the movement of her character on stage. She said, stay back, don't you come towards me another step or I'll what? Some awful thing will happen. It will. What are you putting on now? And then before you know it, they're both inside the bedroom. He says, I warn you, don't, I'm in danger. He takes another step and she smashes a bottle on the table and faces him, clutching the broken top. And I think this has an important suggestion both of their viciousness and the way in which both of them are out of their comfort zones, but also that motif of drinking and alcoholism, of this being the final refuge for her, and that here it's just a broken bottle that she can cling on to in desperation. And this, in some way, triggers his violence. She says, "What did you do that for?" "So I could twist a broken end in your face." "I bet you would do that." "I would. I will if you." "Oh, so you want some roughhouse? All right, let's have some roughhouse." There's a suggestion in the dialogue here of her adopting his language, which is the language of desire in this particular context. And there's a dangerous habit, you feel like when you're analysing this that you're sort of excusing Stanley's rape, but that's not at all what we mean. There is a sense of being driven towards each other, and that her language starts to mirror him in a way that suggests that there's some form of compulsion in the actions that's driving these two characters together. He then springs towards her, overturning the table, and his behaviour mirrors his behaviour with Stella and Steve's with Eunice, this sort of violent destruction of the set. But she does here lash out and try and strike him with the bottle top and catches her wrist. And then he says, "Tiger, tiger, drop the bottle top, drop it." So again, he uses this animalistic language to define her here. And so she, in his eyes, now appears to be at one with him. That she is taking part in an act of brutal savagery, of course, in self-protection here. But again, there is this sense of their, in some way, connecting with each other through the lens of this sort of animalistic desire. And then this famous phrase, sort of one of the famous quotes in Streetcar, "We've had this date with each other from the beginning." Obviously, there's a kind of tragic irony of calling this a date, but also the sense of destiny and of her loss and defeat by this human being. She moans and the bottle top falls and she sinks to her knees. And again, the physicality of resignation is important here. Picks up her inert figure and carries her to the bed. She's become entirely passive here and cannot compete with this physically domineering figure and all of the values that he represents. The hot trumpet and drums from the Ford Juices sound loudly. So again, this is sort of domination of sensory reality of the place itself, offering again a kind of choral-like function, commentating on the action itself.